And until you have the process of free trade, you don't actually know which industries are going to be the industries where you are relatively most productive. You need the process of trade to discover that. You can't identify the industries in advance, then protect them, and then hope that they will flourish.
Welcome to Acton Line, a podcast from the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. A major driver for the increase in wealth and material well-being across the globe since the 19th century has been increasing globalization. But globalization has also created a number of challenges. It has provoked political movements on both the right and the left that are hostile to it and to its effect, often for different reasons. This has led partisans on both sides of the aisle to pursue similar protectionist policies. But what is globalization really? Is it a relatively new phenomenon? And how much water do the cases against it made by both the left and the right hold? In this episode, Philip Booth, professor of finance, public policy, and ethics, and director of Catholic Mission at St. Mary's University, joins Acton's Dan Huger to explore all aspects of free trade and globalization. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/podcast. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and by leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Philip Booth, professor of finance, public policy, and ethics, and director of Catholic Mission at St. Mary's University, Tikka. He was also academic and research director at the Institute for Economic Affairs from 2002 to 2016, and senior academic fellow there from 2016 to 2021. Today, we're going to be talking about free trade and globalization. Dr. Booth, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
So I suppose the best place to start is what exactly is globalization? We hear a lot about globalization, about globalists. Mm-hmm. Let's lay some groundwork here on what exactly is globalization and what all does it encompass?
Okay. I suppose you could think about it from an institutional perspective and then a technical and practical perspective. So institutionally, it's really allowing the free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor. From an institutional perspective, it's a question of removing the impediments which might exist, which are potentially imposed through the political system. And as those are removed, then of course there are technical and practical issues which might inhibit or promote globalization. So what's really happened in the late 20th, early 21st century is that there was both institutional change, which permitted, if you like, the free movement of goods, services, and labor to a greater degree, but there was also technical change, which allowed partly as a result of the internet, although just not only as a result of the internet, also rather boring technical changes in the field of, say, shipping, which promoted and reduced the costs of trade to a much greater degree. And that also happened in the late 19th century. There were both technical and institutional changes happening at the same time.
Okay, so this is a phenomenon, this integration of the world economy at all different sorts of levels is something we see in the 20th and 21st century. But there are historical antecedents as well.
Yeah, so the most recent and I suppose the most referred to period of globalization before the modern period was that in the late 19th century. So from 1870, say, to the outbreak of the First World War, it was a period when throughout much of the world, really, there were no impediments to trade at all. And there were also technical innovations which promoted trade. But not only that, there was pretty much free movement of people. It was possible to travel throughout the world more or less the exceptions being Russia and Turkey, as far as I know, without a passport. And the huge numbers of migrants left the country of their birth to live in other countries. I believe that at the turn of the 20th century, about 10% of the world's population lived outside the country of their birth. You could move capital from a bank account in Britain to a bank account in Argentina to finance the railways development in Argentina. You could ship goods from Germany to the United States, trade on the same terms pretty much everywhere in the world.
That's amazing. And this free movement of peoples is, of course, what largely populated the United States today. Mm-hmm. If we look at those challenges, you mentioned some of those institutional challenges, some of those barriers. What do those look like? And what have been the barriers also in the past that have disrupted? We talked about the 19th century as this great time, but there were obstacles then as well.
Yeah, so maybe let's divide those obstacles into two categories. So one is catastrophic events, which on their own are not aimed necessarily at stopping globalization and stopping free trade, but they have a big impact on trade and globalization. So a period of globalization in the late 19th century came to an end, as I mentioned, with the First World War. That was catastrophic. We never really recovered the levels of globalization which existed in 1913, perhaps until about 2000, 2005. Some would argue that we haven't recovered them at all. So there were these catastrophic events. I think you could argue that the Reformation in an earlier period, the fall of the Roman Empire, these types of political events, which are not intended to strike at the heart of globalization, but do so. There are then political forces which are deliberately aimed at undermining globalization for good reasons, some would say, and sometimes for more malign reasons. And I think these fall into two categories too. They are protectionist measures which are taken ostensibly to help the domestic economy, but I would argue that they don't. So putting on import tariffs, protecting infant industries, that type of thing. There are then regulatory barriers to trade. So in the UK, we banned the import of chicken cleaned with a weak chlorinated water solution. That was also banned when we were in the European Union as well. It's a Europe-wide ban. Now, most people would argue that this is a deliberate protectionist measure, but it's justified at least on public health grounds rather than on the grounds of protecting the domestic poultry issue. So there are threats to protectionism can come in both the major type and also can be an accumulation of regulation, which is maybe aimed at other objectives, but has an impact on trade too. And then there are deliberate protectionist measures to try to protect domestic industry.
Yeah, an American example of some of these sort of indirect barriers would be what we're seeing with baby formula in the United States today.
Yes.
And FDA regulations in the name of public health that prevent baby formula from normally being exported from places like Europe into the United States. No, that's excellent. Now, globalization has transformed the world, but it's transformed the world in different ways in different places. What sort of transformation has happened in the developing world with this latest sort of modern round of globalization? Yeah,
okay. So there are a number of countries which, until 1980, were effectively isolated from the world economy. And this was the most obvious example is China. Vietnam perhaps is a better example in terms of its transformation, but of course is smaller than China. And they pursued a policy of opening themselves up to the world economy and integrating their economies into the world trading system. So that vastly increased the number of people, the opportunities, as economists put it, for the division of labour and comparative advantage to enrich both poor and richer countries alike, and raised the incomes of these countries hugely and lifted vast numbers of people out of poverty. Now, China and Vietnam are perhaps the most dramatic examples because they had a deliberate strategy of integrating their economy, their countries into the world economy, into the world trading system. But there are other countries as well, such as India, which have significantly reduced their trade barriers. Still pretty protectionist in many ways, but they've reduced their trade barriers and participated in the process of globalization and benefited from it.
Yeah. So this allowed a transfer of a tremendous amount of capital from outside of those nations, as well as allowed multinational corporations and firms to come into these countries, create new opportunities.
Transfer technology.
Transfer technology where they hadn't been able to before. Now, the story in the developed world, you allude to that, trade is a sort of win-win proposition, as all of us sort of grounded in economics 101 know. But it had different effects in the developing world. Could you unpack some of that for us?
Yeah, okay. So the developed world, there's no doubt, gained from this process. We got cheaper clothes, specialization in production processes, which means if you buy a car, then the car has gone through a production chain which involves several countries, and each of those countries effectively contributes what it can contribute most efficiently to the production of that car. So you end up with better cars and cheaper cars, and so on, and more innovation and more competition. But of course, if you're starting already from the position of being a country, let's take the UK as a sort of medium-sized country, already part of a relatively well-integrated trading system which involves Europe, the United States, other countries to maybe a lesser extent as well, then the marginal gains from trade are going to be smaller than if you start as if I can use this phrase pejoratively, although accurately, I think, a Maoist hermit kingdom in Asia, which tries to be self-sufficient with complete central planning, and whereas in the case of China, over half the country being below the poverty line and on the edge of malnutrition, and you suddenly start to liberalize the country internally and integrate into the world trading system, the gains from trade are going to be proportionally that much greater. So you measure maybe the gains from trade in the developed world in a relatively small number of percentage points of national income. You measure it in the developing world by the taking of hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty.
Yeah, so it's a more thoroughgoing transformation in the developing world. A smaller transformation, but still net benefits for folks in those nations.
And it's not. And just to stress, it's not in the developing world in relation to these countries by and large. It was not just about trade as well. There are other institutional changes which led to the increases in income, prosperity, well-being, etc.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, in any great transformation, in those transformations that are very, very big in the developing world, in those transformations, still ripple through and affect developed countries, there are folks that get left behind, at least in the short term. What are some of those challenges in both the developed world and the developing world caused by globalization?
So let's start with the developed world, because I think those challenges are easier to identify. So in the US, you often talk about Rust Belt states or cities. And so there are certain parts of the United States which were producing things like automobiles and steel. Let's take those two as examples, where the US was a very significant world producer, and also, certainly in the case of automobiles, a significant exporter as well. And now the process of globalization takes place, or transforms those industries at least, and those things are produced much more efficiently in other countries. And so one thing that happens, and this is the most obvious thing that happens, and people believe they can protect themselves against this if they pursue protectionist policies, is that it's possible to import those things into the United States much cheaper, and that undermines the existing industry and puts some people out of a job. The reason why it's actually quite difficult to deal with the impact of that through protectionism, even if you wanted to, and I don't think that would be a good idea, is because the US can no longer export those things because the world price of those of cars, steel, and so on has fallen. So what the US used to produce, it can no longer export. It can certainly no longer export it at the prices it used to export it at. And no amount of protectionism by the US can do anything about losing its export markets in those respects. So you could argue that for those two reasons, one of them the US is powerless to do anything about at all. The first reason, the increase in imports, the US could, if it wished, stop the flow of imports, but that would be very damaging in my view, that it leaves some people behind, it leaves industries to decay, and people may end up unemployed as a result. There's evidence that economists like David Autor put forward to suggest that this has happened, that this really has been a problem. But even people who identify this as a problem would never argue that protectionism, or rarely argue, certainly economists wouldn't argue that protectionism is the answer. They would argue that if the state is to intervene at all, it would be in areas such as education, reskilling, retraining, helping people to move jobs, and that type of thing. Worth adding that it's not just protectionism which led these jobs to disappear. Cars are still being produced in the US, not necessarily by the traditional US motor companies and not necessarily in Michigan, but in other areas of the US where there weren't the same kind of restrictive practices and where it was possible to embrace new technology more easily. So this Rust Belt phenomenon is not just a trade and globalization story by any means.
Yeah, this is a story of the effects of trade unionism. Mm-hmm. This is the story of a competitive markets in the United States, because we have a variety of regulatory environments, state by state. Mm-hmm. And so there's transformations happening globally, but there's also always transformations happening within nations themselves. If we take a look at the developing world, we talked about sort of the tremendous upside, the rise out of poverty. Is there anyone in the developing world that's displaced by this process? Or are there, perhaps institutional challenges to this that make globalization maybe a net benefit, but challenges exist nonetheless?
Yes, potentially. So, certainly Christian charities in the United Kingdom often give the impression that they would advise developing countries to be protectionist in order to protect, for example, groups of poor farmers. The example is sometimes given of Caribbean countries, which, if they opened up to free trade, would be outcompeted, say, by Brazil and in many of the products that they produce. I think this is a misunderstanding, by and large, of free trade. In particular, I've debated with some of the Christian charities who argue that these countries should protect those industries until they become as efficient as, say, Brazil, so that they can compete with them. This really is a flawed argument, because one of the purposes of trade is to ensure that countries, to help countries produce what they are relatively most efficient at. It may be that Australian farmers are more efficient at producing everything than Jamaican farmers, but what happens in a situation of free trade is that Australia will produce that which it's relatively most efficient at producing, and Jamaica will produce that which it's also relatively most efficient at producing, even if it's less productive than Australia. And then you'll trade, and Jamaica will be poorer than Australia, but everybody benefits. And until you have the process of free trade, you don't actually know which industries are going to be the industries where you are relatively most productive. You need the process of trade to discover that. You can't identify the industries in advance, then protect them, and then hope that they will flourish. Also, the examples that these Christian charities tend to use are almost always, in my experience, in countries which have not really opened up to trade, normally African countries where there's still a high degree of protectionism. And you might get one market opening up here or there, which may affect producers in a particular industry. But, of course, in Asia, you've had this transformation and such a rapid transformation that everybody has been able to benefit from it simultaneously. The losers have been small in number, and the gainers have been very big gainers, and people have been able to move into the more efficient industries very rapidly from the declining industries.
It's an amazing, and I think a great point that, the market is among other things a discovery process, and that these sorts of barriers can be destabilizing in the long term because they prevent that sort of sorting, and that division of labor stagnates, and you don't get the development you would see otherwise. How is this process? We've talked about a couple of these regulations, but it seems like today, in the United States certainly, but I know in many other parts of the world, there's a lot of pushback against globalization. We had, I think, a very much a better sort of global consensus, recognizing the tremendous upside of this phenomena, let's say, 20, 30 years ago. Now is a time when many politicians on both the left and the right throughout the world are questioning that. Mm-hmm. What do these new threats to globalization look like? How much do they recapitulate the sort of old arguments? And how much of them is there anything new?
Yeah, okay. So pre-COVID, I think there were two major threats, and at least one of those was essentially old wine in new bottles. So there's the threat of the suspicion of free trade and what it does to domestic production, the focus on the interests of producers rather than consumers, the belief that somehow a country gets rich by protecting its markets rather than through engaging in trade and in a competitive environment. These are refrains which you see century after century of economic thought. The French journalist, philosopher, economist Frédéric Bastiat wrote about these things quite a lot. So you're seeing a rehash of those arguments from people like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, and as a result of that, trade wars developing between the United States and the European Union, the US and China, and so on, and a weakening of the authority of the WTO. In particular, its court is in a kind of state of limbo, partly as a result of US inaction in putting forward new judges for the court. So you saw a big increase in these types of measures between 2016 and 2020. In addition to that, there's always been the accumulation of regulatory barriers to trade. Sometimes these get knocked down in a trade treaty, and then sometimes they build up again. And they're not only damaging, they're also difficult to deal with because of the huge increase in the volume of regulation in different countries. So it's quite difficult to develop free trade treaties which recognize or somehow deal with the differences between regulation. We talked about chlorinated chicken before, between different countries. And so you end up with these multi-thousand page long so-called free trade treaties, which again, both sides, free traders and protectionists, have been able to take pot shots at because they see those free trade treaties as a stitch-up by big corporations designed to regulate markets in such a way that benefits the big corporations. And there's something in that. So from quite a lot of angles, there are suspicions of free trade, and even amongst strong free trade supporters, they're finding it more difficult, I think, to justify these mammoth free trade treaties, which involve thousands of pages of regulatory requirements and mutual recognition between countries. So the environment is not good at the moment for free traders. Then, of course, you had COVID and a whole new set of arguments related to, we need to be able to produce masks and so on in case we have another episode of COVID or pandemics. I think these are pretty much really bad arguments. COVID came somewhat out of the blue. Of course, the possibility of a pandemic was always something that people should have been aware of. But you never really you don't know how to prepare for these things until they happen. And a really bad way to prepare for them is by domesticating all production, because if your domestic production lines are knocked out as a result of the pandemic, then where do you go for your personal protective equipment and your respirators and so on? And actually, most countries were able to adapt to the problems quite quickly because they were able to access these things from countries which were less affected by COVID. So globalization brings diversification, and I think that brings reduced risks when we have things like pandemics.
Yep. Just like an investment portfolio.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. You spread that risk around. Now, one of the other critiques you'll hear about globalization is that it affects cultures. And in fact, the argument would be that it undermines local cultures, that you get a sort of homogenizing element in global culture. America gets criticized in particular about this as a sort of cultural superpower. How do you deal with those arguments? Are unique in a sense in which you can't do a sort of economic analysis on those, and you can't come to a clean statement of comparative benefits. How do you deal with those sorts of arguments when it comes to free trade and globalization?
It's difficult because I think in some ways the response to that is to some extent instinctive. No, we're all made differently. We all have different virtues, different strengths and weaknesses, and there are some people in life who are really strong, good people when it comes to close local relationships, what's sometimes called in the political theory literature as bonding social capital. And then there are other people who are, if you like, welcoming to the outsider, that they could live anywhere in the world, they're happy when other people from other parts of the world are living in their communities, and those people are sort of strong, if you like, on bridging social capital. And both of those types of, often our vices are complementary to our virtues, and both of those types of people have certain strengths and are important in a diverse community in different ways. You want people who are really good at making close local relationships. You want people who are able to reach out to others. And I think it's natural for the first group to be concerned about the cultural implications of globalization, and natural for the second group to be really quite blasé about the cultural implications of globalization. Now, I've got no empirical evidence to back up that theory, but I think that's part of what goes on. I think some people are just instinctively hostile to the cultural implications, and some people are actually instinctively rather favourable. I mean, what happens in practice is that you get an integration of cultures, but culture changes, and cultures in one country adopt aspects of the cultures of other countries. But you still get differences. You still get different types of differences. People sometimes use the example of chicken tikka masala, which is a kind of invented British Indian dish, which was has a sauce because British people like gravy, but the original was dry, and this was a sort of Britishification, if you like, of Indian food, and you find that type of thing in lots of contexts. McDonald's, okay, there may be a McDonald's in every major city, but the McDonald's menu is no longer the same in every major city like it used to be. The English language is used very, very widely, but actually there's sort of different versions of the English language in different parts of the world. So I really don't see this cultural homogenization at all. And if anything, I think it does enrich cultures as much as anything else.
And it's also something when I encounter these arguments, I always think, human culture is always dynamic and it's always changing.
Yeah.
the fact that we have a Christian Europe, or had a Christian Europe,
Yes.
or have a Christian North America, or have, Buddhists in Japan, is the product of cultural exchange in an era that many critics of globalization would say this sort of thing didn't happen.
Yes.
So these things might be more striking to us. They might be faster, but I think this is a reality of human life and living together.
And we want to take the gospel to the ends of the world.
Yeah.
And that will naturally involve creating a Christian culture, but one which will have be different in different contexts.
Yeah.
The church in Poland is not, or the church in Slovakia is not the same as the church in Guatemala.
Now, speaking of the church, there are critics, and you alluded to this too in some debates with some Christian charitable organizations, but there's also been criticism within the Catholic Church, within other religious traditions, of globalization. What do some of those arguments look like, and how do you engage those?
The arguments normally relate, in fact, to income inequality. So Pope Francis has raised these cultural issues, which as we've discussed, that's a serious criticism with which we should engage and have productive discussion. So there isn't a single answer there. So I think Pope Francis is right, and it's interesting that he should raise those questions. And the Catholic Church has itself, which regards itself, of course, as the worldwide church, has a particular response and should have a particular response to those questions. So the Catholic Church believes in a global church, but at the same time it's saying it doesn't want the homogenization of certain aspects of culture. Well, that's fine. You have to reconcile those things. It needs a discussion. Good that Pope Francis should raise those issues. The other issue which has been raised continually in the last 20 years is the idea of increasing the supposed problem of increasing inequality. Now, the focus in Catholic social teaching has often been actually on raising the status of the poor. Obviously, the rich have a special responsibility and a rather grave responsibility to manage their riches in such a way that they don't alienate themselves from God. But the church has normally focused on the poor rather than on inequality as such. But let's put that aside. So the church the Catholic Church has often criticised globalization on the grounds that it increases inequality. This is quite a difficult claim to substantiate. So it's certainly true that the top 1% of people in the world are getting richer relative to the rest of the world, and globalization is almost certainly an aspect, one of the reasons why that is so. In most developed countries, inequality is getting slightly higher, but not necessarily dramatically so. And in the UK, it's been pretty much constant for the last 40 years. So there's a kind of mixed picture there. But globally, inequality is falling, and it's almost difficult to describe how dramatically inequality has fallen globally. One statistic, although it may not make that much sense to describe it in words. So the US is one of the world's most unequal countries amongst developed countries. If the normal standard measure of inequality, which is called the Gini coefficient, fell by as much in the US as it has fallen in the world as a whole, the US would be moved from being more or less the most unequal developed country to being more or less the most equal developed country. There's been a staggering reduction in global inequality for the first time in a meaningful way in the economic history of our planet.
When we were talking about Pope Francis, I was thinking of another aspect of globalization, because one aspect of globalization that Pope Francis has been enthusiastic about is the rights of migrants and the free movement of peoples, particularly people in distress, in a situation of refugees, these sorts of things. And we've talked a lot about trade. What is the picture of immigration right now globally? And is that, it seems that you have a different sort of controversy about immigration than you have about sort of the free flow of capital or of goods.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are quite a lot of conservatives or economic liberals, as we call them in the UK, who are supportive of globalization in general, but not necessarily so of migration. Now, this has always got to be at least or nearly always, at least to some extent, got to be a matter of degree. There are very, very few people around. There are some, but there aren't many people around who believe in totally open borders. Now, most people, even who are pretty liberal when it comes to migration, would say that we have to do something in relation to the welfare state to prevent migration swamping countries. Others would say actually there's no need to do that because migrants actually don't come for welfare, and they are more likely to work than the indigenous population. So that's a debate to be had. But there aren't many people who believe in totally open borders. So there are two different things going on, aren't there? So there's the significant amount of forced migration and human trafficking, which is arising because of the situations of war in various parts of the world, and also these various trafficking routes in which criminal gangs run. And we feel that particularly acutely in Europe, and it's quite a big problem for the UK because a large proportion of these migrants want to get to the UK. And it's controversial because they often come through a number of safe countries before they get to the UK. So there's lots of controversy about that. And then there's the question of economic migrants, in other words, people who are perfectly free in the country they live in, but they would like to move somewhere else in order to be better off. And people should have the right to leave their own country. Catholic social teaching argues that people do, if they it's not an absolute obligation to remain in the country of your birth, but you should really remain in the country of your birth and contribute to the common good of your community if you can. But at the same time, you do have a right to migrate, and but at the same time, it doesn't follow that every country in the world has a right to accept all economic migrants that turn up in particular countries. So these are matters for prudential judgment, as Catholics would put it. But there's no doubt that the sympathies of Pope Francis lie with the migrants, but most particularly with the asylum seekers, the refugees, the trafficked, etc.
Yeah. One of the interesting things when we talk about particularly these situations with economic migrants, but also the situation, I think, with the migrants in the other categories, the politically oppressed, the refugees, is that the other elements of globalization, that free movement of capital, those free movements of goods, that is something that can help stabilize countries worldwide and create an economic situation in the world where in many more countries you have that option to stay and serve where you are. What do you think of that as a potential? You have some economists, Paul Romer has talked about, setting up, certain legal environments, perhaps different institutional arrangements within developing countries to create, a viable institutional framework for economic growth in these countries. What do you think of those sorts of approaches to dealing with this issue?
There are always first round and second round effects. So just let me say, first of all, that there are movements to promote free trade in Africa. There's an African free trade treaty. If that happens, and there's also a continued reduction in civil conflict in Africa and better governance in other respects. Given Africa's demographic situation, if you could buy shares in a continent, I think it would be worth a punt on Africa, because Asia, Europe, even North America doesn't look great from a demographic position, and also in the way that war and other forms of tension are developing in those areas. And so Africa might be a good example of where there's already quite a bit of desire for economic migration, for people to move to improve their lot. And the same, of course, happens from Asia. And I think the experience of Asia shows that the improvement of these countries economically doesn't necessarily reduce migration, because if you're on the edge of starvation, of course, people have migrated in that situation before, but actually the practical obstacles to migration are much greater than if you're moving up from a subsistence level of income towards middle income. So I think it's quite possible that as these countries develop, they may become more attractive for other people to go and live there, because there might be quite high-paid job opportunities, even if they remain relatively low-income countries for the moment. But more people have the means to leave, to go to other places. And of course, these other parts of the world are going to be very short of people in the coming 30 years because of the demographic crisis. So I think it's pretty difficult. I think you'd have to be a pretty brave man to bet on future migration patterns.
Yeah. No.
Too many variables kicking around there.
There are tremendous opportunities and sort of abiding challenges to an integrated world. And thank you so much for exploring them with us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Cohn.